This edition of Art, Music, and Technology is a continuation of the series on open source hardware and software that's being done in collaboration with Synthopia.com. Thanks to the people at Synthopia for helping to put together these interviews and for helping with coordination of the project. Please check Synthopia.com for more information. Support for this episode of Art, Music, and Technology has also been provided by Apolar Kipso. You can follow Apolar Kipso on Twitter and Instagram at @APOLAKIPSO. Interesting work, interesting artist, check it out. Thank you so much to Apolar Kipso. And now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today I have the great pleasure of getting to talk to someone whose work I follow very closely. I follow it closely because it checks all the boxes for me. It's innovative, it's kind of code oriented, but it's also kind of modular oriented and all that stuff. All the good stuff is all in a pile there. His name's Tom Whitwell, and if you don't know his work, you're crazy. He does the music thing stuff. I am lucky enough to always have a couple of his modules in my systems. They're kind of go-to fun for me. But he's also done a number of other things. He does module design, but he writes some really interesting blog posts. He's a pretty forward-thinking designer, and man, I got more and more stuff to say, but rather than me yakking anymore, let's talk to Tom himself. Hey, Tom, how's it going?
Hi, hello.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
So let's start off with people. So I just sort of gave the Wikipedia version of what you do.
Okay.
But why don't we have you talk a little bit about how you think of yourself and your work?
Yeah, I design modules. I've been designing kind of electronics for must be about 5 years now. And the way I do it is I got into the sort of DIY around Eurorack. I started making guitar pedals, first of all, then got into Eurorack and modules. The thing I wanted to do at the time was really to sort of get these designs out. So I had ideas and wanted to share them. I wanted people to be able to make them. So when I started just sharing designs as open source, the idea originally was that if I published all of the sort of bits and pieces that you needed, so the files to make the PCBs, the files for laser cutting panels, the lists of components you needed, then people could take that and sort of manufacture themselves. It was the idea of a kind of completely distributed manufacturing. So the first module I did that was called the Turing Machine, which is a kind of random looping sequencer. And I published that, and almost immediately, Stephen Grimley-Taylor from Brighton, who runs now runs a business called Thonk, he said, well, I can help people there. I'll do a group buy and help people get the components together and organize that stuff. Mm-hmm. And so that became a business that sells the modules I design and sells modules that lots of other people design. And it's almost like a hardware record label. So my relationship to Steve is very much, I think, I've never been on a record label, but, I will come up with an idea. I will go to him and say, Steve, I'm thinking about doing this. And generally, he's then very enthusiastic and says, well, great, that sounds good. Let's put some out. And I'll always be saying, are you sure? Do you think anyone's going to want that? And he'll say, sure, we'll give it a go. And then he organizes the manufacture and making the kits, and he does a lot of the customer service, and some of the customer service sort of comes through to me, but he does a lot of that and deals with all the shipping and all of that stuff. The modules I design, I suppose I think like anyone, I'm trying to do something that's new and is something that I want to buy that I can't buy anywhere else. Mm-hmm. So if it's something that I can buy already, I'm not usually very interested in doing it because I'd rather just buy it. But if there's something I can see to add, and that may be a small twist or a big twist, then I'll want to make it. And then hopefully it'll be something that other people want to use. And one of the things that's been really sort of interesting and gratifying is sometimes seeing how modules get used in very different ways from how I might think initially. So you put something out into the world and you see what people do with it. That's very, very rewarding. And my stuff is still all open source, so that means people, I think, are sometimes more kind of empowered to do that. So people are empowered to write different firmware for modules that have code in them. They're empowered to make different faceplates and put modules together in different ways. Sometimes people will take elements of things I've designed and turn them into other things that are really exciting. So, in some ways for me, that's often the most rewarding thing, is just seeing how people make something of the thing that I've put out there.
Right. You mentioned that you're sometimes surprised seeing how people utilize your work.
Yeah.
What's like an example of something that kind of you didn't expect?
So the best example of that was the microphony, which I just had the idea that you could put a contact microphone and a little preamp into a module, and it's almost just like a conceptual joke. It's like
Right.
I thought it would be fun that your modular would then all be kind of reactive, and every time you flipped a switch or turn a knob, you'd be able to hear it. And my thinking didn't really go much beyond that. I just thought this would be a fun kind of wheeze.
Mm-hmm.
And then once I designed it, I could see people sort of quite liked the idea, and it had the advantages that it was really cheap and really easy to make. So it became a real sort of gateway thing into getting into DIY. And it was very nice as an answer if somebody says, what should I do first?
Right.
It's cost like £30 or something, and there really is. And we get very, very little customer support because there's really not much to go wrong. But it's a proper kit. It's got proper stuff in it. It's not like some sort of passive thing you have to screw together. It is a real proper way of learning how to do it.
Right.
But what then happened was when Olivier and Mutable Instruments came out with things like rings, and I think it was part of Elements as well, where they were doing this coupler strong stuff with the very, very short kind of tuned delay lines. People discovered that if you sort of stimulated that with the microphony module, with the contact mic, you could do this amazing, almost sort of strumming. You could run a plectrum across the grooves and ridges that are put into the panel. You could be playing it with sort of different textured things, like with, the rubber on the end of a pencil, that sort of thing. And it was this amazing, really interesting, nice effect that I never thought of or imagined, and was much more musically interesting than what I'd come up with. And so it was really, really pleasing and interesting to see that. And then the follow-up was great as well, and that Olivier then got in touch and said that he wanted, he liked this effect. He wanted to do a version of the module. Mm-hmm. And his stuff is all open source. My stuff's all open source. We have the same license. So the answer was, obviously, you can do whatever you like.
Right.
I was incredibly flattered because he's somebody whose work I've followed since he was writing Palm Pilot software. Mm-hmm. And it was also, it was a real privilege to actually see kind of his process from the other side. I mean, the level of kind of detail and commitment that he put into what was, really a quite simple, straightforward module by his standards was amazing. I mean, he added a whole bunch of extra functionality that wasn't in my version. He completely redesigned it and then explained to me what I'd got wrong in my version. And he, put it out, and then he did a deal with Thonk, so the kind of initial run all went through Thonk, so we got, kind of the money out of it as well. So sure. It was just a really positive, pleasing experience, that whole thing of just saying, I did something because it was simple and interesting, and other people took that and made something cleverer out of it than I could have imagined. So, it's a very, very positive experience all around for me.
Well, you also ended up kind of like hacking your own stuff because isn't the chord module
Yeah,
basically just alternative firmware for the radio music?
absolutely. Yeah. So the radio music is the only sort of digital module that I have, and I don't really enjoy programming very much. I mean, I will do it if I have to because I want to make something work. But I see so many people around who are so much better at it than I am, and who do it properly, and they understand it. Whereas, for me, I really wanted to make the radio music, which is this very simple sampler that plays back audio from SD cards. And I had a really clear idea of what I wanted that to do and how I wanted it to work. And that was just within the limits of my coding skills. So I was able to create that. And that again was a popular module, and it was very much built on other things. So that's built on a platform called Teensy, which is a really well kind of maintained and documented audio library. So it makes it very easy for somebody with sort of limited programming skills to make something interesting from it. And because it was all built on that platform, it means there's quite a lot of different things you can do with it. So almost immediately people started experimenting with this, doing different kinds of firmware for it. I was then, I think a year or so after doing the radio music initially, had this idea in the back of my head about a module that would play chords, and a module that was again just a really simple way of getting chords into a module, which is quite a fiddly
Yeah, it's kind of a
thing
feat,
to do.
right?
Yeah, I mean, I've had like modules that are supposed to put out CV for chords, and I just didn't have the patience to sit there tuning analog oscillators to try and do this with it.
You and me both, man. Yeah, absolutely.
That would slosh out, nice, interesting chords in a few wave shapes,
Okay.
and that's exactly what I designed. And then, that was a classic thing of I sort of made this thing, showed it to Steve at Thonk, and said, I've done this. I'm going to put it out as a firmware that people can download. And he was like, well, we should think about doing some extra panels for it, and if people want to swap over to a new panel. And again, it was really, surprising to see how well that was received, and people immediately kind of understood that. And I think quite a lot of people thought, well, I've got a radio music and I use that a lot. Actually, this sounds good. I'll go and buy a second one to try that. And I think, I was very keen that we made sure it was still remain completely open. So if you've got one, you can just download the other firmware and give it a go. So there was no suggestion of, this is something you have to pay extra for if you've got the first one. So I think, that was again just kind of something that I wanted. What's the simplest way you can get to the solution that will do that for you, I suppose.
So I'm curious. You actually surprised me when you say that you're not a code guy and you don't enjoy doing code, because actually a lot of what I've interacted with you, sort of virtually, has been through code related items. I mean, whether it's the radio music and then the alternative stuff for the core organ, or you did this cool blog post a while back called "How I Recorded an Album in an
Oh,
Evening"
yes.
with
Yeah.
Lunchbox Modular and a Python script. And I read
Yeah.
that and I got activated, and I ended up doing a version of that used React to do it like all in a web page.
Well, that's because you can do it properly. That's the thing.
Well, but doing it properly is a lot different than having the idea to do it at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And I mean, there are obviously things that you can do with code that are useful and interesting. And sometimes, and I enjoy that sort of first bit of going from having nothing to having something that kind of works.
right.
But I'm very aware of sort of just the difference between that and something that is properly, shippable and
I
maintainable
see.
and efficient and this kind of stuff. And I think it's one of those things where I can see that there are fewer people who are able to, design and route circuit boards than there are able to write code. There's an
Some
awful lot of people
JavaScript
in the
code,
world
right?
who can write code.
Right.
And I can definitely see, if I'm looking for things that I'm good at, I'm definitely better, I think, at the making the boards and the designing that stuff. And there's a very nice kind of there's a thing I really enjoy about the analog stuff, in that it's sort of finished and it resists kind of feature creep. That's the thing I always find very difficult with software, is that constant thought of, oh, maybe it can do this or that. Then you sit there going, well, if you hold down the button, it does this, and if you double tap it, it does this, and it's all just, I find that it's kind of hard.
It's hard and tedious too.
Yeah. Whereas I sort of like the fact that with the Turing Machine sequencer, because that doesn't have any code in it, it has just these kind of logic chips in it. There's a really obvious feature missing from that, which is a kind of reset, which is a feature that sequencers normally have and is useful. But there's no sort of non-crazy way of implementing reset that I know of, or that anyone's ever suggested in that kind of hardware. So you just, somebody says, well, you should put reset in. And you say, well, yes, but it's not actually possible. It doesn't, there's no obvious way of doing it.
So is that because this is based off of shift registers?
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to, I think, somehow copy the contents of the shift register back a certain number of steps.
Man.
And I mean, I'm sure you could do it, but it just seems silly.
There'd be a way to simulate it in some way. Well, it's funny though.
Yeah.
What's interesting to me is the fact that shift registers have been coming up a lot lately. I just got done interviewing Rob Hordijk recently.
Yeah.
And his Rungler circuit is all a shift register based thing.
Yeah.
And then I just happened to be doing something with Brian Crabtree's teletype module, and I was playing around with shift register functionality in that. So it's just like shift registers seem to be in the air at the moment, which is kind of funny. But I didn't realize the Turing Machine was actually the first module that you had developed.
It was the first module I kind of put out. Before then, I'd done a few sort of DIY things. I did a spring reverb, and I think I did the radio. I made an initial kind of FM radio module. But I think the first one, certainly the first one I kind of published and put out into the world was the Turing Machine.
So I'm a little curious. How did you get into electronics? And I mean, let me ask this first. Do you have like a day job, or is this your gig?
So I have a day job. So my day job is I'm an innovation consultant, I guess, or a sort of product development consultant. So my background is in journalism. I did, journalism postgraduate. I worked in magazines. I was editor of Mixmag, which was a dance music magazine.
That is, yes.
Okay. In sort of 1999 to 2002, I was deputy editor of The Face, which was a kind of fashion style magazine. I then went to work for the Times, so I was kind of head of digital for the Times of London, as some people call it, in other parts of the world, and was there for about 7 years. And so that's my real sort of background is in writing, and then sort of more recently moving into kind of digital and sort of product development and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And I, in sort of 2004, I think, set up this blog called Music Thing, which was a blog about music gear with a sort of, I suppose it was a sort of reaction to the way people often talk about music gear, which is taking it extremely seriously, and this kind of idea that if you buy a particular piece of kit, then you will be able to make wonderful particular kind of music with it. And particularly that kind of idea of you need this piece of kit because it's got this sound, and that's the thing you're buying. And I always thought that was not particularly credible. I think people were buying a lot of things because they wanted them, and that was why I wanted stuff. And it was around the time that all of the sort of VST stuff was becoming very dominant. And I thought, well, actually, if you're really into sound, then you can probably do it in a computer, and that will be, a very good way to make something that sounds great. And you would see people doing that. Particularly, I think also, if you were doing experimental stuff, again, a computer, you get a lot further with, Macs than you might with other things. But I was still really interested in the physical music stuff. And so Music Thing was a kind of blog about just the sort of love of weird music stuff, old things and new stuff that was coming out. And so I did that for about 4 or 5 years. It did seem to become quite popular. People liked it. People, I still meet people who remember it. But then my sort of day job became slightly more pressing when I was at the Times, and so I sort of gave that up about 2009, 2010, I think. And then around that time, I think I was beginning to get into things like Arduino, and just I'd always been kind of interested in electronics, but I'd never known anything about it, or never really done any of it. So Arduino was sort of the first thing that got me looking at kind of components and breadboards and that sort of thing. Designed a few, or made a few guitar pedals from kits and things, and so sort of started getting into it from that sort of angle. And then I think one of the things that attracted me to the Euro stuff was just thinking, well, actually, there's quite an interesting thing to be done here in terms of making stuff. It's a very easy platform to design things on, because you've got all the power and stuff, and the formats are quite straightforward. So you really just need a panel and a couple of circuit boards to create something interesting. And I think that there is such an opportunity to do different things compared with something like guitar pedals, where if you're not making a distortion and a delay and a chorus, it's pretty hard going, I think. I think in the modular stuff just seemed a really exciting open place, and it was around the time that Make Noise was getting started. The sort of weird, the sort of Grant Richter stuff was coming out,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, it just seemed like an interesting thing to try. And so I really sort of taught myself how to do it by reading books like Nicholas Collins's Handmade Electronic Music.
Electronics, yeah.
Yeah, it was really that sort of thing of just starting, and the old Electro Music Forum that was a really good sort of place to learn electronics at that point. And just a lot of these kind of simple sort of logic circuit synths, the sort of Lunetta synths that really Nicholas Collins talks about a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that was how I really got into it. And then you just go from one thing to the next and next, and you then think, well, I'd quite like to make a circuit board for this. And once you've mastered making circuit boards, the thing becomes repeatable and shareable and sort of publishable. It becomes a thing that people can make. So I think that was in some extent it was a bit it was similar to the way blogging happened in sort of the mid noughties, because my background was in magazines. So if I in 2004 had wanted to set up a magazine about weird music gear, I would have needed like £1 million and the backing of a decent sized publishing company, and it would have sold 20,000 copies, and nobody outside the UK would ever really find it, and it would have just been this enormous faff.
Right.
And then blogging came along, and you could say, well, why don't I just have a go at this and see what happens? And was able to reach this audience. And so I think by sort of 2012, I was beginning to see that with access to Chinese manufacturing, being able to get things like circuit boards printed very, very cheaply in small numbers meant there was something that was kind of possible to do there, and potentially could be kind of opened up in the way that blogging kind of opened up publishing to a much bigger audience.
Very interesting. Well, and the other thing, though, too, is that, going back to this idea of like, blogging sort of democratizing publishing, there was another thing that happened, which is all of a sudden people found out that they weren't the only weird person that loved
Yeah.
this stuff. I mean, if I think back to, I started kind of getting into modular stuff myself in the mid 90s.
Yeah.
And I remember people would look at my stuff and be like, they'd kind of cock their head a little bit and they'd be like, why on earth would you want to do that?
Yeah.
There are so many better and more interesting things to do in my digital synth. Why would I ever want to do such a thing as that,
Yeah.
right? Um, and so very much I felt like, well, there's nobody else that likes this stuff. And then I ran into Grant Richter, and he and I, just started doing stuff together, and that was a neat to have one other person. But it wasn't until the internet kind of lit up, and we could start these little forums and stuff, and all of a sudden you find out, oh wow, there's 1,000 people, or
Yeah.
there's 2,000 people that are into this. Who would have ever thought?
And that was exactly the experience of doing that music thing blog. Was just, I will write, do the most obscure and sort of self-indulgent thing I can, and there is an audience for that. And I think in many ways I don't think that's not actually an aberration in terms of journalism. I think actually in terms of doing journalism in magazines,
Right.
that principle was actually exactly the same, and the best magazines, the most successful magazines, were the ones that had a kind of singular, well, not singular as in from an individual, but they had a kind of vision that was, self-indulgent, and it was committed, and it was exciting. I mean, I remember reading when the Beastie Boys published their magazine Grand Royal in the 90s. It was just an amazing thing to see people taking an idea and going with it,
Right.
and doing that in a, they had the money to do it in a platform that was a printed magazine.
Right.
But it was a kind of precursor, I think, of lots of the good things that have come out of the internet culture, really.
Yeah, indeed. So it's interesting that you kind of got into this from the tech side and all that, but I'm also, I have to say, I'm kind of blown away that you were with the London Times and stuff. That's an amazing direction. How did you even have time, let alone the background, to not only like learn and embrace the electronic side, but also why music? Why not drones or model airplanes
I
or
don't know.
something like that?
I'd always, loved music, and I've never felt I'm particularly useful at making it. But have seen other things that I can do that I'm, better than an average person at writing articles, probably. I'm now better than an average person at making circuit boards. I'm not really better than an average guitarist at playing the guitar, so much as I, would like to be. But it was, it's a case of finding the things that you're able to get good at, I suppose. And in terms of the time, I suppose I just go to bed quite late.
Yeah, there you go.
I've always had hobbies that are absorbing, I suppose,
Right.
alongside jobs that are quite
Demanding.
yeah. If you've got a demanding job, then actually having a quite engaging hobby can be quite a useful sort of release.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great point. Well, I think that it's interesting, though, if you don't consider yourself a musician, to what extent was the Turing Machine and sort of its semi-random, generative kind of a thing your way of saying, let's get the machines to help out?
It was exactly that. It was, I mean, it was actually finding. So I remember I still have it, a Pressure Points, the Make
Oh yeah.
Noise sequencer, which is
Hmm.
a really nice sequencer. But I realized that what I did with it was set the knobs to random positions, and then let it play and listen to it, and then maybe move on a bit, and that this sounded like Steve Reich or Philip Glass a bit. And I thought, well, this isn't. It's not right having a thing that you can set precisely and then not setting it precisely, just setting it randomly. It didn't seem like a conceptually sound, really. It was like, so I thought, well, is there a way of creating something that does that, automatically? And it was, I suppose, looking then at all of the other things that have come along, all of those shift register sequences, whether it's the Triodex Muse that Marvin Minsky did, whether it's
Right.
the Buchla 266, which has a similar shift register thing, Grant Richter's, or both the Woggle Bug and the Noise Ring have similar sort of things. So there was all these kind of systems using shift registers to make kind of random sequences. And I was just kind of experimenting with those circuits and trying to see how to get them to do what I wanted them to do. And it was just, trying to get something that would kind of loop and would slip was sort of the process I was trying to get to.
Well, I think that one of the things that's really interesting about shift register based sequencers is they seem to tickle the brain in a useful way, right?
Yeah.
Because there's patterning, but it's not completely repetitive.
Yeah.
And it's generative, but you can still grasp kind of a sense of what's going on. It almost seems like there's a thought pattern behind it. And I think that that's something that our brains really light up over, right?
Yeah. After doing that, I then did some experiments with just creating patterns from like an Arduino and then triggering one of those electric acoustic sounding pianos from it.
Right.
And it was really interesting how the very first thing I did was I set it to create random, like 16, pick 16 notes on a scale. So pick a scale, pick 16 notes, give them random velocities and play them over and over again. And I was amazed that when you plug that into a piano, it sounds quite a lot like, one of those Spotify ambient chill playlists. And I don't mean that to insult the people who make those Spotify ambient chill playlists, because it really struck, because I did this and I thought, well, that's quite interesting. And then I set it so it would just like change a note every couple of bars.
Right.
And that sounded really good. And that was interesting. And then I got into, putting like Markov chains into it and trying to make it more sophisticated. And it just became less and less interesting. And I was really struck by this thing of just, it's actually, the magic is keys. I mean, having things in key is quite a clever invention. Mm-hmm. And just repetition. Yeah. And certainly for me, I remember there's a story where Brian Eno wandered around Marble Arch and Hyde Park Corner with a tape recorder running and recorded just random street sounds for 3 minutes. And then he played it back to himself over and over again. And he kind of learnt it. So he knew, oh, okay, this bit's coming up where the newspaper seller's going to walk past. Right. And he said once he'd learnt it and remembered it, it became very credible music. And so I do think there's something about repetition that is just, absolutely critical. And I just kind of wonder whether you can get a very long way into music that is pleasant to listen to with really, really simple things to generate sequences and repetition.
Right.
And that, I suppose, was, to some extent, that's a little bit disappointing. You think, well, there surely should be a bit more to it than that. But at the same time, it's interesting, and it definitely. I mean, that whole experience, I think, of when you listen to an album the first time and you don't really get it, and then 15 years later you listen to it and you just know it like nothing else, and, right. And it's incredible emotional impact on you that it wouldn't have had the first time you listened to it, because you haven't learnt it and you haven't kind of absorbed it and you haven't had that repetition. So I do think there's something really interesting there about how music works, I suppose.
Sure. So that makes me curious. What kind of music do you listen to? Especially with a background with Mixmag. It's funny, yeah. you were at Mixmag about the time I was actually reading Mixmag, yeah. Here in some little nose-pick town in the U.S., so far away from any of that stuff that it wasn't even funny, but it seemed like an alien world to me. But I'm just kind of curious, like, what did you take away from that, and what is your musical taste in any case?
I'm not sort of listening to the latest kind of trance remixes, but I like, electronic music like that. I like chunks of like folk music. I do have I listen to a lot of music, and one of the things I found really interesting in getting more into this kind of stuff and into getting into modular and that has been just encouraging me to get a much broader sense of taste, I suppose, because you get interested in this stuff and then you think, well, what music is made with this? And so you you seek out, people like Morton Subotnick or the kind of early electronic music there, and then you're in quite a different world from what is sort of normal music.
Right.
And I remember reading Alec Ross's "The Rest Is Noise," his history of
Mm-hmm.
20th century music, which was, is an amazing book. And I think reading that, I just got completely opened up into a world of music that's interesting to listen to and interesting to read about. And, people like John Cage, who I could read about all day long, I'm not really going to listen to a great deal of his music, but there are bits of it I'll listen to. But I am fascinated by that world, or I'm
Right.
fascinated by people like Lamont Young. I wrote a piece recently. I went to see him playing when I was in New York for Machines and Music, and just the sort of density of stories and history and kind of creating new things, in that sort of history of 20th century music, I think is amazing. But I mean, I will listen to, I could listen to people like Steve Reich and Philip Glass all day long.
Mm-hmm.
We'll listen to, I don't know, all sorts of things. It's what, I read quite a lot about music. So I was reading, there's a great book called Electric Eden, which is a history of folk music in Britain. And so suddenly I'm then listening to, Fairport Convention records,
Right.
which is obviously different from what I was listening to before. So I do listen to quite just a lot of different things.
Interesting. The other thing I really wanted to talk to you a little bit about, because I know it's important to you, is the idea of the open source and the open hardware community. And it's kind of neat that this is a thing that the modular world has really embraced. There are a lot of people that I know that actually have limited themselves to DIY stuff that is based off of like open circuits, open
Yeah.
hardware, or if it's digital based, then open software too. I'm curious why initially you decided to go that way. Because in the early days, it would have been really easy to say, well, hey, I could start a company doing this and, buy. I'll never forget when I interviewed Paul Schreiber, he was like, "Well, hey, if I start selling modules, I might be able to buy a new stereo." Right?
Yeah.
That was his that was his motivation to get into it, right? How is it that you didn't decide to sell them and get a new stereo?
I mean, I don't know. I think I came into electronics through the sort of maker movement, I think,
Hmm.
through things like Arduino. And so it always seemed like the normal thing to do in many ways. And I think, when I started, I had this idea of just saying, well, is there a way of getting this out and publishing it to people? As I said, it was almost like kind of hardware blogging.
Hmm.
And to do that, you obviously needed to make the designs open. I mean, one of the really interesting things that I didn't really think of at the beginning was just the discipline of having to show your working is really interesting. If you're somebody who's not from, I'm not an electrical engineer at
Right.
all, that thing of actually saying, I'm going to design this and I'm going to publish it so people can see it. And
And then
the
take
sort
the
of,
beating for it, right?
well, that was it. But I mean, but the other side of that is, well, if I've messed this up, somebody can suggest how to improve it.
Right.
And I think that was the part of the thinking when I started. And that's been quite true. And it does mean that you can put something out and other people can say, well, you could do it like this.
Hmm.
And that, does happen sometimes. I think that being part of that sort of DIY, I mean, it's in some ways it's difficult to say because it's kind of something that I've done and it would just seem a bit strange to do it
Differently
anyway
now, right?
differently now. I mean, I'm getting more looking at modules that would need to be manufactured in some way. But I think you'd probably still want to have the DIY stuff as part of that. So when you look at something like the Surge modules that Random Source do,
Hmm.
they're very, very dense, very they need to be manufactured by a
Right.
machine.
Right.
But they will sell them either as a completed thing or they will sell them as the kit. And I think there's a value that people get from the kit stuff.
Kidding
I
about.
think
Yeah.
I think then what came along later was seeing how Olivier did exactly the same thing as me with the same license.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a sort of journey on that. I think from there was a point when people started, to some extent, you say sort of it's not right to say someone was taking advantage of it, but I think it was a case where somebody would say, "Can I do this?" And you'd say, "Well, I'd kind of rather you didn't." And they would say, "Well, I'm going to do it anyway." And you go, "Well, okay. I mean, you can do that." As I said, I would much rather you didn't. And actually, for me, all of those cases have gone away.
Yeah.
There's nothing at the moment that I'm looking at and going, "Wow, I'm really annoyed that somebody is doing this thing. I don't want them to."
Yeah, I was kind of curious about that because it does seem like that's one of the things that could be a hazard is that just because you aren't going to you're trying to make it open and freely available doesn't mean that other people aren't going to try and capture a commercial market from it. And maybe not in a great way, you know.
Well, I suppose the thing is we are capturing a commercial market from it. So I think Thonk have probably sold 2 to 3,000 Turing machine kits or circuit boards. That's probably not complete kits, but
Right.
that's a really big chunky amount
It's a
for.
big number, yeah.
And so it's not like we're not creating a product that people can buy. And in fact, I think that's where for me it got annoying if somebody said, well, I'm going to make these really cheaply because I don't have any costs and I'm
Right.
not do the customer service and I'm not going to add any value to it. And you just thought, well, I'm through Thonk, we're selling these things and we're selling at this price because we're employing people, we're doing it nicely, and we're making a profit.
Right.
And for somebody to come along and say, right, I'm just going to do this stuff super cheap, and it was kind of annoying. But equally, I've had conversations with those people, and they've said, fine, I don't want to do that. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
trying to be bad about this. So I think
Right.
the communities, I think it has resolved itself. I talk to people about it. They're saying, well, aren't you worried if you publish your stuff, then Behringer can come along and make a rip-off of your thing. And you're just saying it would take a Behringer engineer 90 seconds to rip off any of my modules.
Right.
And then it would take them 2 weeks to do an amazing job of working out how to manufacture it for the right price in China. And that's what they do. And they will do that to anyone in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they can see my schematic and have a laugh at them is really neither here nor there, I think. So it's really just about. I think there was something I was reading the other day that was Adafruit, who obviously kind of started a lot of this stuff. And when Limor Fried did the original 303 clone, she did the Xbox, open sourced all that. I think she said that the license isn't so much a legal thing as these are the people I want to hang out with.
Yeah.
And to some extent, it's that. It's not to say that, if somebody doesn't want to do it open, that's fine as well. But I think seeing the community of people taking, particularly Olivier's modules, which I think was difficult at the start of seeing that happening.
Yeah.
But I think now you're starting to see just the amount of learning that community's got and the amount of kind of ambition, and people are then saying, well, we're not going to do things when people have asked us not to do them. And just, a whole bunch of people learning really quite sophisticated electronics manufacturing and then learning how it works. And I will use Olivier's modules and go, well, I'm trying to figure out how to do this. And you'll go and look at his module and say, oh, okay, well, that's probably a sensible way of doing it. And I've met people when I went to Bifaco have a fantastic modular meetup in Barcelona, and there were people there who were saying, "Oh, I've seen your circuits and I've seen bits of your code and bits of your code are in this module I've made," and that's again that's another just really kind of rewarding part of the process that I think me sitting there saying, "Well, I've designed this thing and I'm not going to tell you what it does, but buy it," just wouldn't give you that.
Right. Well, Tom, unfortunately, our time is well up, and I had a bunch of other stuff I would love to talk to you about. But I have just one question before I let you go because I'm curious as hell. What kind of things do you have on the workbench right now that you're working on, or what are some areas at least that you're finding interesting?
At the moment, the main thing that I'm sort of trying to finish off at the moment is there was a module I showed at Super Booth last year, which is called Startup, and is a really, really small. Well, it's a 4 HP. It's a mixer and a headphone amp and a sort of tap. It was a LFO, the original prototype. And this was very much that idea of these really small modulars. So the little lunchbox modulars, the kind of thing you need for them actually to be portable is a nice headphone amp that sounds good, some way of mixing a few signals together. I wanted some kind of stereo spread because I like stereo and things. And then some kind of a clock normally if you're trying to get things going. So I just thought, well, I actually, before going to Loop last year, made a little prototype headphone amp along these lines that was just really, really nice to have in a hotel room and this little module you could carry around, and just, sounded really good. So it was very nice for that, just being in your headphones, doing something quietly with sometimes sort of smaller sounds. So I did a prototype of it at Super Booth that was not very good. It kind of worked, but not quite right. So I've been sort of fixing that, learning how mixers work properly rather than the initial one I did. And so that's sort of finishing off and going out to prototype. And then, looking at some sort of small, sort of standalone things that aren't kind of some big desktop synth, but seeing whether there are things that you can do with kind of batteries and things that you can carry about a bit.
Well, that sounds good. I have to admit that I'm becoming a little entranced of battery powered stuff just because sometimes it's fun to just go to the park and play.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Tom, I want to thank you so much for having this talk. And I want to thank you for being willing to kind of just like talk all over the map. We kind of like buzzed around the area, but it was a lot of fun, and I feel like I know a lot more about you and your perspectives than I did before. So I want to thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
All right, and with that, then I am going to let you have the rest of your day. So thank you so much, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Man, I love Tom's work. Guy's really amazing. If you haven't checked out the Music Thing stuff, you really need to. You can buy the kits at thonk.co.uk, as well as other places all over the world. Really great work. You need to have some of it in your rack if you don't already. Thank you so much to Tom. Thank you so much to Synthtopia for helping to put this together. Thank you to Apel or Kipso for the assistance in updating some of our internal machinery. We should have that active here in the next week or two. And finally, thank you to you, the listeners, for showing up every week and checking it out. I really appreciate it. If you feel like it, you can drop me a line, ddg@cycling74.com. Always love hearing what you're up to. Thanks a lot, and we'll catch you next week. Bye.